So this last Thursday, not long actually after we recorded last week's bulletin, former President Donald Trump was indicted on 37 federal charges related to his handling of classified documents after his term in office. This indictment alleges that Trump, among other things, willfully retained classified information, refused to hand them over when officials requested them, concealed the documents after they were subpoenaed. His aide, Walt Nauda, I think I'm saying that right, was also indicted on 6 related charges. Joining us to talk about this is Matt Martens. Matthew is a lawyer with almost 3 decades of experience. He served as a federal prosecutor, a criminal defense attorney. He also at one point clerked for Supreme Court Justice William Rehnquist. And he's the author of a forthcoming book from Crossway on criminal justice reform. This is coming out this November. Matt, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning of this to just talk about what's in this indictment. Why does this matter? Why does Jack Smith, the special counsel, what is he arguing in terms of why this is worth pressing charges?
Yeah, so the charges fall really into 2 buckets. As you noted, there's 37 charges against the former president. The first 31 are under what's called the Espionage Act, which alleges essentially that the former president, had unauthorized possession of and willfully retained national defense information consisting of various top secret documents, which are probably at this point emblazoned in everybody's memory from the photo of them laid out on the floor. And then the remaining 6 charges against the former president relate to obstruction of the government's investigation into whether or not he had those documents. So there was a grand jury subpoena, and in response to that subpoena, the allegation is that various false statements were made about whether everything was produced. And this is sort of the story about the boxes moving around in the effort to hide the documents and mislead the grand jury and mislead the prosecutor. So the first 31 charges are about the possession of the documents. The remaining 6 charges are about obstruction or false statements in the investigation of the retention of the documents.
Yeah, and it's when you read the indictment, one of the things you see, these are documents that were created by the CIA, the NSA, the Pentagon. They include information about our nuclear capabilities, our vulnerabilities, as well as that of our allies, our war plans for retaliation should we attack. I mean, it really boggles the mind a bit. When you read the charges, when you see the photos, everybody's probably seen not just the photo of the Mar-a-Lago bathroom, but like now the million memes for that photo. The Ark of the Covenant being stored in that bathroom was maybe the funniest one that I saw. One of the more significant pieces of evidence in it is they allege to have a tape of Trump essentially bragging about being in possession of these things and admitting in this conversation that he hadn't declassified them and he more or less shouldn't have the position. I guess I wonder how, when things seem stacked up the way they are, what's the case going to be for Trump's lawyers and his attorneys? What's his defense going to look like, as you imagine it, if you were his criminal defense attorney?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I've actually tried to spend some time reading and understanding various of the arguments that have been put forward by people who are defending the president, to understand what the legal argument, at least in particular, is. I don't know what factual defenses they'll make yet, but I wanted to understand what the legal argument was. So as I mentioned, the first 31 charges are brought under the Espionage Act. And the Espionage Act requires that someone who has unauthorized possession, and that's the key language, willfully either disclosed or retained those documents. So those 2 pieces are going to be very important: willfully and having unauthorized possession. So you've probably heard people talking about the Clinton socks case, right? This has now become one of the most famous cases in America, the Clinton socks case, as the former president called it. This is a case involving President Clinton and a historian he hired to help him prepare an oral history of his time as president. And there were 79 audio tapes of either interviews with the former president or meetings that President Clinton was having, maintained by this historian. And then former President Clinton had the tapes apparently in a sock drawer in his house, these 79 tapes. And a group brought a lawsuit seeking to recover those tapes for the National Archives. They were arguing that they were presidential records and that they should be part of the National Archives. And interestingly, the court said that the question of whether documents are presidential records and thus must be in the possession of the National Archives, or personal records, which a former president can keep, is a decision that belongs to the president. not to the archivist. And so I think what they're going to be arguing here is that, back to that clause, having unauthorized possession, they're going to argue that the president had authorized possession because it is his decision whether or not records are presidential records or personal records. Now, I think that strikes a lot of people as bizarre, that documents that have national security classification markers on them could even conceivably be personal records. I actually looked up what the definition of personal records are under the Presidential Records Act. It means documentary materials of a purely private or non-public character which do not relate to or have an effect on the carrying out of the president's duties. There's no conceivable argument that classified documents from the CIA are personal records. But the defense I think they're going to make is that's the president's decision to make, not the archivist's or not Jack Smith's. And so if those documents were personal records as determined by President Trump while he was still in office, as he was leaving, then he doesn't meet the element of having unauthorized access. I think that's the argument they're going to make. I think it strikes people again as implausible that documents of this sensitivity could just be designated with no ability to challenge that. But that's the argument it'll make in the first instance. And then I think the second argument is, I mentioned that word willfully. So willfully in the criminal law has a technical meaning, which means something close to you knew you were violating the law. Normally, ignorance of the law, as they say, is not a defense. But if a statute has the element of willfully in it, it does require proof of something like you knew you were violating the law, or at least you knew you were doing something wrong. And his argument will be, listen, even if I'm wrong about the so-called Clinton Socks case and whether it says I can do this, I believed I was right. And so I didn't act willfully. It's subjectively, I believed I was acting lawfully. So I think that's going to be the argument, the focus of the defense. It's going to be a legal argument combined with saying, even if I'm wrong about the law, I didn't have a criminal intent. That will probably be the defense to the Espionage Act charges. The obstruction charges is harder, and this is where people often get tripped up, right? We've seen over the course of time any number of cases. We can think back to the Martha Stewart and investigation for insider trading, and ultimately didn't get charged with insider trading, but with obstruction. And as they say, the cover-up can be worse than the crime. And so the more difficult charge for the former president could be defending against the obstruction, the providing of false information to the grand jury. If you say I gave everything back, and then they do a search warrant and find out you didn't give everything back, the question is going to be, did the president know that? Did he have people for that? Did the people make a mistake? Or as alleged, was there an effort to conceal things? Those are going to be the issues at the centerpiece of the defense.
And Matt, what do you say of the argument that you can't listen to anything the DOJ says or does because Jack Smith has already demonstrated partiality to Biden? This is part of Biden's kind of sick dogs, like they're sicking their dogs on him. What legal sense do we make of that?
I guess what they're essentially saying is some degree of some sort of selective prosecution, that Hillary didn't get prosecuted for her emails and Biden didn't get prosecuted for having his documents in his garage or wherever it was, or I guess Mike Pence didn't get prosecuted for having documents. So I think there's sort of a couple points to be observed there. Sort of one, we should want impartiality in the enforcement of the law. We should want similar cases to be treated similarly and dissimilar cases to be treated dissimilarly. And so it's not wrong for people to raise that question or raise concerns. We should hold, particularly as Christians, where scripture teaches over and over about impartiality and judgment, we should want that from our officials. So it's a legitimate concern. But the point is that similar cases should be treated similarly and dissimilar cases should be treated dissimilarly. And the description of, while I'm not here to defend what Hillary Clinton did or what Joe Biden did or what Mike Pence did, having documents describing war plans and discussing them at your country club with people shouldn't have them is very different than sloppily or even intentionally taking documents with you and having them in your garage. Those are different things, and they are materially different things. That doesn't mean that I condone the other cases, or even, I'm offering an opinion on whether those should have been prosecuted or not prosecuted. But I do think we have to be realistic that not every violation of the handling of classified materials is the same. We should, though, raise questions about whether or not those cases were handled properly, and I don't fault anyone for raising those questions. We should ask that as citizens. Are we getting impartial justice in America?
Yeah, it's funny when you mentioned the Clinton Sox case. The first time I heard someone mention that, I actually wasn't familiar with that one in particular. I was familiar with the Sandy Berger case, which was
also involving socks.
Oh yeah, former Clinton aide goes and stuffs classified materials into his socks and pants to smuggle out of I guess maybe out of a skiff or wherever he was viewing those documents. And in that case, I mean, Berger was convicted and I believe served time. It strikes me as such an interesting contrast. Like, it's such a moment of tribalism, right? Because so much of Trump's message in 2016 was, look what she did with the email server. This is disgusting. She doesn't love this country. And the whole mob is shouting, lock her up. And now you have charges that in many ways, as you point out, are more severe. And part of Trump's defense is basically saying, oh, this wasn't a big deal. And we actually have a clip here I wanted to play. This is Senator Marco Rubio, who's been making rounds offering a similar defense of Trump. Let's hear this.
This prosecution was a choice. There is something called prosecutorial discretion. The federal government uses it all the time. It's what they use not to deport people. It's what they use to release a bunch of rioters and thugs that burned down parts of the city here in Washington, D.C. And they had a choice to make, and they should have looked at this and said, there is no victim here. There's no harm that's been caused. Even if everything they allege is true, which we don't know if it is, but even if everything they allege is true, there's no harm to the country, but there is certain harm now from this. This will deeply divide an already polarized and volatile country, doing tremendous damage to America at a time when we should be focused on the threat from China and the threat we face to our greatness. We are subjected to this ridiculousness because it was a choice, a political choice by a prosecutor. That's why they chose to do this.
So Rubio is making this argument around, prosecutorial discretion, that Jack Smith made a decision to bring these charges. He didn't have to make this decision. And he's referencing all these other charges that weren't brought. Again, this is related to the Clinton thing as well. What do you make of this argument around discretion? This idea that there wasn't harm done, no blood, no foul. There weren't spies floating around Mar-a-Lago that we know of. What do you make of this idea that as a matter of discretion, this was more divisive to the country and more problematic?
So I think I would start with, again, I think it's perfectly legitimate to raise questions about whether or not there's even-handed justice. I do not think it's fair to affirmatively accuse people of acting with bias or with political motives without evidence of that. And I think it's bearing false witness, to use the biblical term, to say that Jack Smith acted with that intent without evidence that he did so. It's fair to ask the question. It's not fair to make an accusation without evidence. So I'd start with that as a Christian. I'd say, secondly, prosecutorial discretion is a real thing. It is recognized by the Supreme Court as essentially unreviewable, not entirely unreviewable, but very close. The idea is that no prosecutor, no police force has resources to prosecute every case. And moreover, not every case that might be a technical violation of the law warrants the force of the criminal law. And so prosecutors are supposed to exercise discretion. We want them to exercise discretion. We want them to recognize that not every case should be pursued. I think to say that this is a victimless crime, if it's true, is a bit irresponsible. If it's true that war plans were being shared with people in a country club with who knows who present, to say that that's victimless, I think is a bit much. Anybody who's worked in the government and had a top secret clearance, and I did, recognizes the severity and seriousness with which those rules are enforced, the accountability to those who have those permissions, the documents described in the indictment, if those were in fact treated so carelessly, I think would cause most people who have a security clearance to be shocked. And so it's not, to say it's victimless, I don't know how we know that yet. The whole reason you can only look at those documents in certain places is because of surveillance capabilities that other nations have. And so I don't know that anyone's in a position to say, or at least any civilian is in a position to say that it's victimless. So again, there's a difference between raising fair questions
Right.
and making loose and irresponsible accusations.
I thought on that note, one of the funnier comments I heard was Jim Garrity at National Review said, our best hope that no one found these classified documents is that the whole place was such a mess. No one could find anything. All right, let's pivot out a little bit to kind of look at this more broadly. Let's talk about the response to the indictment. We heard this clip from Marco Rubio the day that the indictment was announced. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy came out similarly saying, with a vigorous defense of Trump, this is overreach, this is over prosecution. They're always looking for a way to bring him down. Things were a little more muted Friday after the actual indictment was released, but nonetheless, the support seems to be there, even from some of his rivals in the primary campaign. Then yesterday, a Morning Consult poll that was conducted after this news broke showed that Trump got a 4% bump among primary voters. He was up from 55% to 59%. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is at his lowest yet at 19%. Behind him is Mike Pence at 8%. And everybody else is 2% or not statistically significant, as they say. So I remain 8 years in kind of baffled by this and by the support for Donald Trump, especially when you kind of break down the history. And I'll try not to monologue too long here, but he never won a majority of votes in the primaries in 2016. He won the Electoral College, but didn't win the popular vote when he beat Hillary Clinton in 2016. His presidency was unpopular enough that he lost the House in 2018, lost everything in 2020. And in 2022, with an unpopular president and an unpopular Democratic majority, this red wave is supposed to come in. It didn't happen largely because the hardcore Trump supporters and election deniers that were running, they almost all lost. He's lost a civil case involving sexual assault and slander. There's this indictment in New York that most of the legal experts I've heard from seem to think that's a much weaker case. But nonetheless, he's under indictment in New York. He's under indictment in Florida. There's suspicion he's going to be under indictment in Georgia before long. And I just find myself scratching my head going, how are we still here? How is this getting stronger as we go along? And so I'd love to hear, Nicole, maybe from you first on this. How do you understand the strength of that support?
Yeah, I appreciate the way you laid that out, because I've been thinking a lot about what does this mean about American society? What does this mean about American culture? But also, what does this mean about American evangelicalism when one report said as many as 60% of white evangelicals are still voting for Trump? And I think it builds on what some might say are these quote unquote American core values. So this platform builds on the core value of the underdog, the way that when someone is persecuted or when someone is quote unquote oppressed, that person has a least likely chance of winning. But the American dream says the least likely of us can rise up and become somebody. So the more apparent or perceived persecution Trump receives, there's a stronger swell of, but we can rise and we can overcome and we can do this. And I think there's also kind of a building on our previous themes of fear. Trump has a way of galvanizing people according to what they fear. And even Christians, even, very educated people still have fears of the other, of what will happen if they lose their place or lose their power or lose their privilege. And Trump has a way of projecting an image. If you follow me, I will protect you from them. And then I think the last part of it is just the sense of power. People like people in power. People like people who make statements about power, whether they can be validated or not. So I think who he is and the platform that he has taps into some of the things that we are going to have to wrestle with as time continues. As Christians, what do we do with earthly power? As Christians, what do we do with fear of the other? And as Christians, what do we do with the victimization or the sense of victimization? How do we revive a sense of Christian allegiance that allows us to be critical about things and not just go with the flow of the crowd?
Yeah, I mean, picking up on what Nicole just said, I've been reading a very interesting book recently called The Godless Crusade by Thomas Kremer, who is a believer, teaches at Oxford. And he did a survey to try to understand this rise of populism in the West. So he interviewed 140 officials, government officials in Germany and France and the United States to understand this rise of right-wing populism. And in his thesis, and it's been interesting, I've been thinking about it a lot recently in light of the issues you've raised, Mike, is that there's a realignment in society, that where there used to be a left-right divide around ideology, it's now a left-right divide over identity, sort of to Nicole's point about the other. And it's that the rise of populism across the West has been facilitated by people who are sort of defining the other. The other is the non-Christians in significant part. And Christians is used, Kremer argues, more as an identity marker than as a religious or theological marker. And I think that's why I think Kremer's onto something. I say this as a non-expert, but he seems to be onto something, that he's put his finger on something that no matter what behavior someone engages in, if they are representing us against the other, if they're fighting for us against the other, they maintain support, because the defining feature is no longer a belief in Christian character, but in Christian as an identity marker. It's a very interesting thesis. I recommend the book. It just came out, The Godless Crusade, and it's caused me to think a lot more, and I feel like he's one of the more insightful people on this topic.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it kind of gets at this other element of it for me that I find so interesting about the Trump phenomenon. And I think it's the kind of thing that you see mostly when he's in front of a crowd. I heard someone point this out. I think it was Matt Continetti was pointing this out the other day on the Commentary podcast. He said, you know, the genius of when Bill Clinton was facing impeachment and when he was facing, you know, charges of lying under oath and all of this, his quote unquote, you know, three-dimensional chess was that he knew the law inside and out, and he was playing with the language. And that famous quote of his where, you know, it depends on what the definition of is, right? He was threading this needle that, you know, again, that's sort of his slippery genius, was his way of navigating all of that. Trump has a different kind of genius. He knows nothing about policies and these sort of things, and sort of makes no apology for it. He has this animal instinct that, and I don't mean that pejoratively, but he has this animal instinct of he's got the antenna, right? He knows what's in the room. He knows what's happening. Because there was this moment on Tuesday night during the speech that he gave a speech after he'd been at the arraignment, and there was this moment that kind of perfectly encapsulated. He's in the middle of the speech and he makes some comment, and then someone in the crowd yells out happy birthday to him. His birthday was the day after the arraignment. Let's play that clip.
Thank you. Happy birthday. Great birthday. Nice birthday, isn't it? Nice birthday. Wonderful birthday. They were saying happy birthday. I was with Eric and Laura, the kids. Happy birthday, Grandpa. Happy. And I said, oh, great. I just got charged with, they want 400 years approximately. If you add them all up, a fake 400 years. Oh, thank you, darling. That's so nice. It's a wonderful birthday. We're going to make it into the greatest birthday of all. We'll make it into the greatest of all.
And so to me, that clip just encapsulates the Trump thing so perfectly, because what you hear him doing is he's got the sense, this crowd adores him. He's got the sense of what it is, and then he feeds it and feeds it and feeds it, and then essentially gives his tag at the end, the word great, American, the sort of American greatness tag with all of this. And there was a similar moment. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. There was a similar moment in the Caitlin Collins town hall when she's pressing him. He's saying, I'll end the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours. And she's pressing him for an answer as to how. How's he going to do that? And his answer was, I want people to stop dying, right? And what's interesting to me is it's almost, not to get too nerdy with it, but it's almost Augustinian, right? Like, it's all about desire. It's all about speaking to what do you want? This dream of a great America, the vision of a war ending. He has this way of feeding that. Talking about it to somebody the other day, and I was like, it's like they're all serving saltines and this guy's flaming hot Cheetos. Like, everybody wants the flaming hot Cheetos.
I mean, listen, he reads the room, right? He reads the national room in a way he understands. What's remarkable to me about it is that a billionaire from New York understands a significant swath of the country that he did not live in. But he understood, it seems, and has continued to understand better than anyone else out there. It's remarkable. And, whether he stumbled into it or whether he's a genius, I guess someone will figure that out someday, but he certainly has figured it out and recognizes that with the substantial displacement and reorganization and changes in our culture, that there are people very troubled by some of the trends, understandably. And he's able to tap into that and be their fighter. Again, back to the Kremer proposition of sort of an us against another, and no longer an ideological us versus another.
Well, last question for you. Here we are. It's June 2023. When will this see trial? Is this going to happen before the election, after the election? What do you imagine?
In theory, the federal criminal law provides for a speedy trial within 70 days. That almost never happens. There's various exceptions to the 70-day requirement, particularly as the case is more complex. So typically, even in any complex case, you would be probably looking at a trial 9 months to a year later. What's going to slow things up here is that there will be undoubtedly a substantial amount of classified information that is in the evidence that has to be disclosed, which means you need defense lawyers who either have security clearances or they have to get security clearances. And then there's questions about how that evidence gets used or introduced in court in a way that doesn't impair national security. So there's a statute called CIPA, C-I-P-A, is the acronym that governs that process. It can be a very cumbersome process. And so it is very possible that even a judge with the best of intentions of moving a case along speedily couldn't get this to trial before the election. It's possible, but I think probably not the most likely scenario. A trial is probably a year and a half or more away.
Well, Matt Martens, thank you for joining us here on the Bulletin. We appreciate
thanks for having me.
Matt's book comes out this November from Crossway. The title is Reforming Criminal Justice, a Christian Proposal. Thanks again, Matt.